Hello, everyone, and welcome to the who, what, when, and how of communicating about your project. Absolutely delighted to welcome you back, and particularly delighted to welcome Jan Christie today, who's going to lead this presentation. Hi, Jan.
Hey, Terry, how are you?
Very good, thank you. This is, for those of you that have been following this series, and even if this is the first one that you've jumped into, this whole subject area of communication is just so critically important. And I know Jan's going to stress that for you, but also that it's very often one of those things that is overlooked. We think that we're communicating too much, but very often we're not communicating enough. So Jan's going to jump into literally all of the bits and pieces with respect to that. With all of that being said, again, welcome everyone, and over to you, Jan. Really looking forward to this one.
Thanks so much, Terry, and good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning here. I'm not sure where everyone is joining me from, but I'm going to go with morning. So I'm based in Sydney. As Terry said, when it comes to communicating about projects, often we think we're communicating incredibly effectively, and very often, but what we'll often find is that's not really quite the case at all. So today's session is very much around the fundamentals of all of those elements of communicating about a project. So for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to assume that you have an established project that's either already underway or it's ready to go. So we're not talking about trying to pitch your concept to someone. We're talking about within the parameters of the project itself. So that's my starting point. The second thing that I just wanted to mention before getting into the nitty-gritty of the session is to echo what Terry said. Can you ever communicate too much? No. The way in which you communicate might need to vary, but you need to be constantly communicating. So this is one of those sessions where the title and what you're getting pretty much line up. So what I'm going to do is work through the who, what, when, and how of communicating in relation to your project. Now, I do have the questions or the heading in that order for a particular reason, because I do think that this is a really good way to think about what it is you're going to be communicating and the way in which you're going to do it. It gives you a nice structure, and I do have a couple of models that I'm going to share with you that hopefully will help you with that. But that's not to say that you need to step through this way with every single piece of communication. I just like the logic of this. So we're going to begin with looking at who it is you need to communicate with, precisely what it is you're going to be telling each of those groups of people, at what point you need to have those communications, and then the mechanism by which you're going to do that. So hopefully a fairly straightforward structure. But before we get into that, there are two things that I want you to think about first. I'm not going to go into these in a lot of detail in this session, but it's really important that you keep these things in your mind as we work through. So the first thing I want you to think about is your own personal preferred communication style. So let me assume for a moment that you are responsible for the delivery of your project in some way. You're the project manager, you're a team leader, you have a responsibility for a significant proportion of the project, but it's going to be on you to communicate with others about your project. So one of the things to be really aware of is how you prefer to communicate, and think about how that's going to impact on the way you communicate about your project. What level of detail do you like? Are you a really big picture person? Are you, give me the concepts, don't worry about the details, someone else will sort that out? Or are you somebody who likes to know the intricate parts of each element of the project and how they fit together? So it's really important to understand what your preferred style is, and then to think about those you're communicating with. What mechanism of communication are you going to use? Are you going to be using written communication? Are you going to be using verbal communication? How might you do that in terms of face-to-face or electronically? So what is the preferred mechanism that you like? I'm going back to ancient days now, but when I first started practicing as a lawyer, I worked for a partner whose way of communicating in relation to anything I had drafted was, I would print it out, I would give that to him, he would mark it up in a blue pencil, and the note would always begin with, thank you for your draft. It didn't matter if he then completely eviscerated it, but it always began with, thank you for your draft. And I got very used to that way of him communicating. I knew what he wanted. So do people know how you like that? Are you more comfortable communicating one-to-one, or are you more comfortable with one-to-many? So are you good at facilitating a meeting, for example, or do you feel more comfortable in a one-to-one interaction with people to ensure that they're understanding what's going on? And the other thing to bear in mind is pace of communication. And again, I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but some people communicate incredibly quickly. They speak quickly, they think quickly, they act quickly. Everything happens very quickly. If you are one of those people, sometimes you need to stop and think about how that's being received by others. Do you need to moderate your pace? So that moves into that question of, are you aware of the impact that your particular style might have on others? Now, if people are used to you and they know that that's the way in which you're communicating, they'll often adapt, but sometimes you need to adapt to them. Am I going too fast? Is this someone who actually needs more detail? Is this someone who really likes to get it in writing so that they can then track through what we're doing? So thinking about how you might adapt and adjust your style where necessary is important as well. So that's just a very light touch on just your preferred communication style and methods of adapting that style. The second thing that I want you to think about broadly before we get into the nitty-gritty is about your project itself. So as I said, I'm working on the basis that you already have an established project in place. So my first question for you is, if somebody said to you, tell me about your project, can you clearly and succinctly and really effectively communicate with them what your project is? And I don't mean, I don't mean the elevator pitch, I don't mean the jargon grab line, but are you able to really clearly and very, very effectively say, this is the project, this is what we hope to achieve, this is where the outcome sits? Are you able to do that? If you're not, it's a really helpful exercise in terms of communicating more broadly to get yourself in a position where you're able to do that. And in order to do that, here's some questions to really think about. What is the purpose of your project? Why are you doing this? Because once you can tap into that purpose, you're able to communicate far more effectively about what it is you're trying to achieve. So is the purpose to assist those you're working with? Is your purpose out in the community? Does it have a greater good? What is underlying it? Why are you doing this? And really importantly as well, why do you care about it? You're going to ask others to care. You're going to ask them to be involved. You're going to ask them to engage. So you need to know why it is you care, why you're involved, why you engage. So what it is that you care about. Being very clear about your key milestones. Now, they may not have specific dates attached to them earlier on. They may, it depends on the project itself. But do you know where you're going to stop and measure and tell people where you're at? So what are those milestones? And as we all know, no project ends looking like the way you thought it would at the beginning. It evolves, it'll change as time goes by. As that happens, are you still able to describe it as clearly and effectively as you could at the beginning? So does your communication about your project evolve along with the project itself? So those are just some things to keep in mind as we start to work through the 4 elements that we mentioned at the beginning. So the first one is the who. Now, in starting with the who, and I realize I sound like an owl saying that time and time again, what's really important is to broaden your mind as much as possible. When you think about who is involved with your project, It's not enough just to stop with, this is the core team, or this is who the project is initially for. I want you to really expand your minds about who might be impacted, who might want to know, who might you need to influence. So one of the things I thought it would be useful to start with is a little bit of a mind map around who it is you might need to communicate with in the course of your project. Now, of course, this is going to depend from organisation to organisation. It's going to depend on project to project. But what I really want you to think about is your category of who is usually going to be far broader than you initially think it is. So these are just some of the ideas that I thought of in terms of the projects that I know have gone through the Centre for Legal Innovation's incubator process, for example, knowing who might be affected. So the really obvious ones, your team. Clearly, you need to communicate with the project team. The question of who is on that team is something we'll come to in a moment. But that's a fairly obvious one. Your stakeholders. So who are the core stakeholders in your project? And again, sometimes those stakeholders are not as immediately obvious as you think they might be. So who within your organisation is championing the project? Who might be interested in championing the project who you hadn't actually thought about yet? Who has an interest that you know that they're on the sidelines but not quite sure of what they might be doing? So think broadly about your stakeholder group. Think broadly about who it is you need to influence. Now, at the moment, I'm speaking about a project as if you are part of an organisation that's delivering one, but you may be a project team essentially of yourself or one or two others. So you may be working with other providers to deliver something. So they are part of the who as well. They may be part of your team. They may just be providing a service that you need to build on. But that's another thing to think about. A couple of things that sometimes people lose sight of in the heat of a project and getting it done is the end user. Who is this for? Who is going to use this? At what point in this process do you engage in some kind of a conversation with those people? And how do you know who they are? So you might have a target audience for your product or for your project or for your process, but is that a finite group? Is that something that might grow? How are you going to connect with them? So having a really clear idea of who your end users are from the beginning, even if it evolves as the project evolves, is really important because you need to have a communication strategy in place to reach them. The other group that I think we sometimes overlook is any regulators that might need to be involved. Is the project that we're undertaking impacted in some way because of regulation in our industry? Do I need to get approvals? Is there some sort of formal process I need to go through? In terms of, for example, my role as an internal learning provider to a law firm, I need to make sure that what I do complies with the rules of the legal regulators. Otherwise, my lawyers are going to get really unhappy if they can't claim their CPD points. So whatever I do has to have those regulatory elements in mind as well. If you have questions, do you need to contact the regulators? So I want you to really think about that concept of who as a much broader sense than you might otherwise. And the final one I want to touch on is community. And I know that that's an incredibly broad concept, but I think more and more as time goes by, people want their projects to be more broadly meaningful than just what happens within their organization or within the specific project itself. So is there some way in which your project impacts on the broader community? And if there is, who in that community do you potentially need to communicate with? Do you need somebody to give you advice? Do you need somebody to share the information? What is it? What is that connection with community? Who are the community leaders you might be reaching out to? So my suggestion is mind map it, whiteboard it, whatever it is, but be really open about who it is you're going to be dealing with. That's a really useful way to start that exercise. So having widened your sights, I have a little saying that I quite like that I'm going to share with you, and I think it's a really useful one, particularly in the context of what we're doing today. And that is, who is in your own personal circle of influence? Is there an organizational sponsor for your particular project if you're within an organization? Do you have a mentor or a coach who you can reach out to who is going to be able to help you? Are you collaborating with other people, either within or outside of your organization? So, how are you going to influence those people? But the one thing I also wanted to touch on is this idea of the extended network. And one thing that I think we often forget is we think about our own network. I know these people, I have this circle of influence. But one of the things I've learned over the years is that one of the most effective things about my network is that they have a network. And they are always happy to share that network with me. And that can happen exponentially. So if you're not sure about something and you think I might need to impact or engage with someone else, reach out to your network. One of the most important members of my network is Terry. So I often come to her and say, this is something I'm thinking about. Do you know somebody? So really reach out, really think about that network. And then the how you communicate with them is a different thing, but the who becomes broader and broader. So I always like that idea that the network of the network just keeps on growing. And I work on the theory that anyone Terry has any remote connection to in any way whatsoever is part of my network. Useful thing to think about. Bringing it closer to home though, and back down to your particular project and organization. When we think about the who, we can think about the who in two different ways. We can think about the individual who, this is the particular person I want to connect with. This is the particular person who I'm going to communicate with. But there's also the question of that who by role. And one of the models that I thought I would briefly share with you is this RACI model. So who is responsible for a particular task within your project? So thinking about who is responsible, that might not be an individual, that might be a role description. So a coordinator is responsible for X. A business analyst is responsible for Y. So who's going to actually do the task? The next step in that communication profile is who is accountable. So even though they might not be the person who's doing the task, they're responsible for its delivery. So that may well be you as a team leader or a project manager. I am accountable for the delivery of this. Who is going to be consulted? So who are the subject matter experts I need? They might not be a core integral part of the team, but I need to reach out to them at different times and bring them in and engage them. And who just needs to know when it's done? Now, it may well be that responsible and accountable are the same person. That may overlap. So there may well be some overlap between the roles. But this is a really nice way to step through thinking about how do I communicate with those who are responsible and need to do? That's a delegation process. How do I communicate with those who are accountable? What information do they need in order to ensure that their accountability is met? So those are the kinds of things to think about when you're using this model. So that's the first model I thought I would share. But the second one is one that I think is a really useful one to think about as well. And this is what I kind of call a modified stakeholder model. And it's one that I had a bit of a play with, thinking very much about the kinds of projects that I think you might be doing in your space. So the first thing is we've got your project sitting in the middle. And of course, you have thought about that and you have your clear, concise, effective way of communicating about what it is. What we're then going to have a look at is the various levels of communication with your stakeholders. And you'll see there that we've got a traditional matrix pattern. We have a stakeholder interest from low to high, and we have a stakeholder power or influence from low to high. So if you think about the people in your organization, again, if you're working internally, or the people you need to engage and impact if you are working as a standalone or an external project manager, think about where you might put all those various people that you identified when you mind mapped. So somebody who has really low interest and very little influence on the outcome of your project, you might just need to keep them informed. And by informed, that might be an update in a meeting. It might be a quick email as a milestone is reached. It may actually just be it's done at the end. So that's not a particularly sophisticated method of communication at that point, but you do need to at some point just let them know what's happening. So that's that first group around low interest and low power. The next group that I'm going to talk about is the stakeholder interest is very high, but the power of that person is very low. And it can sometimes be easy to say, well, they can't really influence the outcome, so it's not really worth investing too much time in communicating with them. And that would be a fallacy. The people who have a really high interest in your project, even if they don't have an enormous amount of power in terms of its outcome, are really great for building energy around your project. So if you not only let them know that it's happening, but every now and then you consult with them, you step in, you ask them what they think, and you consider what they think and what they have to share, you're going to get some really enthusiastic, engaged suggestions there. Now, it may have no impact on the ability to deliver the project ultimately, but what they will give you is that expansive thinking. So those people who have that interest are incredibly useful to your project. Then we're going to move up to the next sort of top corner, the low stakeholder interest, but high influence. So these are the people who will have a lot of say over whether your project goes ahead in the first place, the way in which it is delivered, any approvals that you might need. These are the people you need to inform and consult enough to be satisfied that they're happy with how things are going. It's a really fine balance between telling them enough and keeping them involved and engaged enough without bogging them down in the detail they don't want. So if this is a project that's just ticking away and all you need is their tick off, think about exactly what it is they need to know in order to provide you with that. So they just need to be consulted enough to satisfy that they know what's going on, they're happy with what's going on, and they will influence in your favor. And the fourth stakeholder group is the one that is going to be the most benefit to your project and the one you are going to have to engage with and communicate with the most. And that's where the interest is high and the power is high. So these are the stakeholders who can absolutely make or break your project within an organization because they have that level of influence and they are really invested in the outcome. So these are people you're going to need to collaborate with, not just tell, not just let know things. Sometimes that interest can be really challenging. If you've got somebody who's incredibly powerful and highly engaged, they'll often challenge your thinking. They'll challenge the way in which you might want to proceed. But you need to be able to communicate, and we're coming to this, the how and the what of your project in order to ensure that they remain on board. So thinking about your stakeholders as a group, it's really important to think, it's not just I need to communicate with my stakeholders. You need to actually look at each kind of stakeholder and think about the right kind of communication with them. And that's quite a sophisticated process, and it's worth mapping in this way just so that you make sure that you're getting that right. So that's your stakeholders, but the other group that it's incredibly important to make sure you're communicating with effectively is your team. So the first thing to think about is, in terms of your project team, do you have a clearly defined team? Do you have a team within your organization, or do you have a fully established team outside of that? If the answer to that is yes, are they all really clear on what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, what's going to be delivered? Do they know what their roles are, and do they know where those roles fit into the grand scheme of things? Now, again, as projects evolve, roles evolve, nuances happen, but it's really important that people are aware what they're expected to deliver and where that's moving. And in the event that things shift and change and they have questions, do they feel safe speaking up in the team environment? At the end of this session, I'm going to touch ever so briefly on the importance of psychological safety in teams, but this is probably one of the most critical aspects of a high-performing team. Are they safe? Do they feel safe? Can they share? Are they happy to speak up? If you don't have a defined project team, it's really you against the world and you're trying to deliver that. Who do you actually consider to be part of your team, even if it's not in a formal way? Now, who are your providers? Who are your collaborators? Who are your advisors? Who are you tapping into? What access to information do they have? Do they have the same sort of access as you, or are you only able to give them small parts of information about the project? If that's the case, how are you going to communicate that? Where are the guidelines? How do you get them on board? What is it you tell them? How open are you going to be with them? And again, do they know specifically what their roles are? So thinking really critically about how your team is going to work, whether that's a clearly defined team or a more amorphous kind of group of people, how are you going to communicate with them is incredibly important. So we've talked about the who, and I've spent quite a bit of time on that, but I think that fundamentally underpins everything else, because the who really then determines the way in which you proceed. So what we're going to move on to now is what. So we've talked about these are all of the people. I need to communicate with them about the project, but what exactly is it that you're going to communicate with them? What I have done is I've created a flowchart that I suspect may be a little bit challenging to read on the slide I'm about to show you, but bear with me and I'll step through it as quickly as I can. So in terms of this communication flowchart around the what, the first thing I would recommend that you do is look at your stakeholder model and build out what I call a communication grid. So low interest, low power, need to know very little. They need to know these fundamentals and work your way up. In terms of each of those stakeholders, and indeed then each of the other people who are interested in the project in some way, exactly what do they need to know? What level of information do they need to have? Do they need to have technical information? Do they need to know the politics behind a project? Do they need to know more than simply their task? So who needs to know what? The next question is at what point they need to know it. And we're going to come to that in a little more detail in a moment. But not everybody needs everything all at once. You're not dumping an entire bucket of information on someone in one big swoop and then walking away. So at what point are you going to give them what information? And then how are you going to communicate it with them? So this is that order that we've talked about, the who, the when, the how, and then what systems or processes are you going to set up in order to do that? So making sure that the right bit of communication gets to the right people at the right time. But then if we come back to this notion of what level of detail do your stakeholders need? Remember at the outset, I talked about your preferred style of communication and thinking about the preferred style of communication of others. So if you have an absolutely key stakeholder who's high interest and high power, who loves detail, even if that's not your preferred communication style, you will give them detail. You will give them data. You will give them that ability to analyze and make decisions for themselves. Conversely, you might be somebody who thinks that there's nothing more exciting than a sophisticated spreadsheet with all of that data, but all I want to know is the top line. So think about the relative role of your stakeholders or those you're communicating with and adapt that what and what level of detail to those people. But generally speaking, depending on their role or the individual, the things you need to think about in terms of your communication are, what are the key deliverables? So what is it, you, person I'm talking to, or me as your provider of information, what do you need to know? What milestones have we already achieved and what are we moving towards? What tasks are we undertaking and how are those broken down? And then particularly in terms of your team, what are those action items? So some fairly fundamental skills around delegation there. So that's your level of detail. Allied to that is, what level of knowledge do your stakeholders have to have in order to play their roles? So if one of your stakeholders is a subject matter expert, the level and kind of knowledge you need with them is very different from somebody who is a sign off at the end, just tell me the bottom line and off I go. So you need to really think about, what is it I want from this person so that they can do what I need them to do? And in order to get that from them, what do I need to communicate to them? And what is it I need from them? Do I need them to influence others? So what do I need to arm them with to do that? Do I need information from them? In which case the communication I want is effectively coming back to me. Am I going to be tapping into their experience or their expertise? In which case, how am I going to elicit that? What am I going to ask them? And what actions do I need them to undertake? So all of this is a bit more than, yes, just keeping them informed as to what's going on. So that's a very long-winded sort of way of looking at it, but I think it's really helpful to step that out in detail. But coming back to that preferred communication style, I am a detail person, so I quite like this. But what if you're not? What if you're the big picture person? So this is my too long didn't read version of that chart. Who needs to know what? When do they need to know it? How are you going to tell them? Some fairly fundamental things to think about. So in terms of the next step, we've talked about the who now, we've talked about the what. As I said, the last thing we want to do is deluge people with information. It's really important not only that we communicate effectively in terms of who we're talking to and what it is we're telling them, but we need to make sure we do this at the right time so that people get the information when they need it. So it may be that for your general project team, that's an ongoing conversation and information is being shared and exchanged on an ongoing basis. But again, if we come back to that broader group of who, your stakeholders, your end users, your regulators, when is it and at what point do you need to tap into them? So again, a couple of suggestions that I hope will be helpful for you. The first is thinking about a more formal or structured approach. So in terms of the communications, you need to be quite thoughtful and rigid about. Going back to that communication grid that we just worked through. In terms of your stakeholders, in terms of your team, in terms of anybody who sits outside of that, where do you need to set a formal meeting schedule? When is that going to be needed? And having a mechanism in place to do that, which is part of the how. Now, I want to drill down on this a little bit more than you might think is really important, necessary. I mean, it's pretty obvious. We set meetings in place. We have team meetings. We have regular stakeholder updates, whatever that's going to be. And that's true. But there are a couple of things that I think it's really important that you bear in mind when you're setting up these meetings. The first is, we all know that we have an amazing ability to fill the space that is allocated. So if we set up a meeting for an hour, it'll take an hour. So I want you to think really critically in terms of what needs to be communicated in these formal processes so that you can be really clear about what we're going to get out of this and making the best use of people's time. So the when is not just about it happens at this time, but for this long, and it has this purpose. if this is a whole of team meeting where you're going to work through quite a sophisticated agenda, by all means, allocate the right period of time. But do be aware of the way in which meetings can just eat up time when they don't need to. And I think sometimes those project team meetings can become a little bit of a, well, I've done this, everybody knows that, but I'm going to take 15 minutes to tell you anyway. So think about how regularly you need to communicate with somebody, depending on their role. So if we go back to that stakeholder grid that we looked at the beginning, that stakeholder grid means that low interest, low power, you might communicate with that person twice through the whole project. And that might not be a formal means of communication, or it might be an email or something like that. But if we go to the other extreme, if we go to the high interest, high power, how are you going to make sure you schedule those interactions? You're not necessarily going to want that person involved in project team meetings, but they're going to want regular updates. So popping those in would be useful. Work around your key milestones. So thinking about what those key milestones actually are, thinking about what they are for different sets of people. So you're going to have your project milestones, but your different user groups, if we go back to the who, will have their own milestones. So also think about that and where you might need to connect in and communicate with them. And if being in lockdowns and working remotely has taught us anything, it's taught us the challenges around scheduling meetings. It's taught us that people have other commitments that we may need to really think about when we're scheduling. It's really easy to just say, let's pop in a meeting and have it at this time. But we're now talking about working more globally. We have project teams across time zones. So thinking about what time it is for others, what commitments they might have. If we're scheduling project team meetings, but we know that a member of the project team does school drop-off, for example, let's think about that when we're scheduling. So it's not just thinking about the precise timing of a meeting, but also what it means for those involved in order to maximize their involvement. So I encourage you not just to whack a recurring meeting into everybody's calendar, but to really think about, do we absolutely need this meeting? Does it have to happen every week? Does it have to happen with everybody who needs to be involved? Really, really drill down and think about those questions. The next element around the when, though, is that more informal and unstructured communication. This is the communication that happens around those formal meetings. So again, I want to drill down into these in a little bit more detail. The first I wanted to talk about is, do you actually need to set parameters for communication outside those formal meetings? And the reason I say this is because, yes, there's going to be chats in corridors, or there's going to be phone calls, and there's going to be email exchanges. But is it important to ensure that all of that communication is appropriately shared with those who need it? And this is where things can often fall through the cracks. If we're talking about that informal, unstructured discussion, it's really important to think about, in terms of what I'm talking about, is this something that actually needs to be more broadly shared? Is this something that needs to step into a formal environment? Or is it okay to have these kinds of discussions? What kind of communication do you want happening outside those formal meetings? Are there sub-teams around your project that you're happy to have go off and do their own thing and come back and report? Outside of those formal meetings, what kinds of interactions might you have with your key stakeholders? You know, are you happy with casual conversations with a quick update, or do you want that to be more formal? But thinking about that is really helpful. The next thing that's really useful to think about is, particularly if you are the team leader or the project manager, be really clear about your accessibility. When can people contact you? How can they contact you? Are you happy for them to check in at any time? Or do you have some structure around when you're going to be available? Are there particular blocks of time that people will be able to access that you're going to put aside and say, if you need me, this is when you come and talk to me? So again, thinking about making yourself available, but in a way that works for you and is effective for the project. It doesn't have to be really rigid, but within the parameter of, on a Friday, I don't have any scheduled meetings. This is the time where if you need to just ask me a quick question, I'll be available to you. Thinking about that kind of thing. One of the things that it's really important to do as a team leader as well is just checking in with your team broadly, seeing how they're traveling, and checking in with them not just about the project. Now that might sound a little bit, we're talking about communicating about the project right now, but often you'll get a sense of how people are traveling just in your general conversation with them. So make sure you know how your team is. Keep in contact, keep that collaboration in place, especially if you're working remotely or virtually. Make that extra effort to stay in touch and to make those connections. Now, the next bullet point might seem like a little bit of a contradiction to what I've just said, which is to have a reason to meet. There I'm talking about those really formal meetings, those really structured ones. Don't have meetings just because we've got a meeting scheduled. If you have nothing to talk about, use that time more effectively elsewhere, or use it as an opportunity to have those check-in chats with your team. But really thinking about those meetings as being the formal ones, they have a purpose, they have an agenda, they have a reason why we're doing them. And if none of that is relevant, then we don't have them. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has sat in a million meetings, only a slight exaggeration, thinking, why am I here and why are we even having this? So just because it's scheduled doesn't mean you need to have it. The other thing to think about in terms of the when is if there's a substantial change or something critical that impacts on your project. And essentially going back to the beginning of that communication grid that I've spoken about, and almost starting again because the influence and the impact on what you need to do will change, and doing a bit of a reset. And what has been informal may need to become formal for a while as you work through that change. So be prepared to be flexible about those kinds of things. The final element that I wanted to touch on now around the communicating about your project is the how. And I'm going to be incredibly honest with you. I suspect all of you have far more knowledge around the various platforms and technology that's available in order to effectively do this than I do. I've got a couple of suggestions, but really I know that there are some amazing tools out there that you can use both to manage your project and to manage your communication around your project. I would love it if you would add your suggestions around those or any great ideas you've got into the chat or into the Q&A and share those with others. Really helpful to think about those. But let's come to the how now in a little bit more detail. The first thing I would say is often when we start looking at these things, we do think, I've got to get all of these sophisticated processes in place. I have to have all of these sophisticated platforms. Start with what you have. What is it that you already have available that you can use as a mechanism for communication? Now, in the real life world, that's relatively easy. We talk, we sit down, we book a meeting room, we write on whiteboards, we do those kinds of things. For the moment, I'm just going to focus a little bit more on those virtual platforms where we're not together. They have so much functionality that often we do not even begin to understand how to use. So really get to know the functionality of whatever platforms you're using and make the most of it. Get your teams really engaged in what you have. So, use those whiteboards, share data however you think is appropriate, use the various mechanisms available, whether that's unmuting to speak, using chat. I think sometimes the most effective meetings happen when there are chat conversations going off to the side that everyone can see, but there's still a discussion going on. You can see the engagement happening there. So really thinking about the way in which you use your platform. Think about verbal communication in the virtual setting. I think we're all far more used to this now than we ever thought we were going to be. But in terms of your communication, when everyone is remote or has joined virtually, you need to think about a number of things you might not in a face-to-face session. So, you'll often need to speak a little more slowly because people are engaging in a different way. Do you need to moderate your volume? Are you someone who speaks very quietly? And often on a remote setting, your microphone might not pick that up as well. So thinking about your volume. Think about the tone of voice that you're using. But there are other things as well. There's that, talking over the top of each other. How are you going to manage that? In a remote meeting, are you, if you're the team leader or project manager, are going to facilitate the meeting and reach out to people and make sure everyone is engaged? Or are you going to let people really just join in as they wish? And again, that's really a matter of how your project is running. My other question is cameras on or cameras off? And I know that this can cause a whole heap of angst for people. I think if you're talking about a project team that is working together in terms of their day-to-day communication, it's probably not quite so important to have cameras on because you've got that discussion going. But if you really want to connect with people and you really want to engage and you want to make sure that everyone is involved, my preference where possible is to have cameras on. You can see people's faces. It can be a bit intense constantly staring at a screen. You can't look away in the same way that you do in person, or otherwise people think you might be distracted. But in terms of that connection with people, in terms of that effective communication and seeing whether what you're saying is really landing with them, I'm a big proponent of cameras on, but I do know that for some people that's not as easy as it might seem. But where possible, I would absolutely say, try to have your cameras on. What I want to do now is talk really specifically about the communication with your project team itself. So we've talked a lot about stakeholders and the people out there, but I just want to really drill down on the team itself now. And one of the things I think it's really useful to do is to agree the mechanisms for your team with your team. What works for them as a team? Now, that might not be always your preferred method of communication, but if it's something that's going to be really effective for the team as a whole, give it a go, embrace it, see how it works. You're not wedded to it, so you can adapt it and you can change it as things develop, as projects develop, as different people come in and out of the project team. But having that agreed mechanism is really important. It gives people a sense of certainty. It gives them a sense of knowing where to come to and how things are going to happen. Be clear about when you're going to use different forms of communication. So if you are going to communicate via email, what is it people should be looking at for email? What are you going to send? Are you going to send links to bulky bits of information that are not easily shown in a meeting or on a screen so that people have that available? Are you going to email agendas, or are they going to be in a calendar invitation? Are you going to email something specific that you want raised at a meeting? So is email your more formal kind of communication with the team, for example? And then you might use a communication app of some kind to have that informal communication sharing. So just checking in, flicking through an article, thought you might be interested in this. I heard about this. Oh, did you see this news? This is what's been happening. Now, I'm not saying that these are the only or the best ways of doing it. It will vary from team to team. For some teams, a communication app is just not the way to go. It's not the best way of keeping a record of information, and you much prefer using email, or a particular platform. You might be using Planner, you might be using one of those project management tools. One of the things that it's worth really thinking about when you're using those sorts of tools, though, is what is the administration and upkeep of those tools to make them really effective? You know, do you have somebody who really needs to be on top of it all the way through in order to ensure that that tool is being used effectively? Thinking about the project meetings themselves, how are you going to have those happen? Always have an agenda. It might be a really brief one, but there are people who need to feel prepared for those meetings. They need to know what's going to be discussed. So we have an agenda that will shape that discussion, but it's always good to have an element of flexibility to it, even if that's an other business that people want to raise at the end. But give people a sense of shape to that meeting. Where it's at all possible to do something around the way in which you communicate, agree it with your team. So if you're going to change things, if you're going to go to a different platform, if you're going to communicate in a different way, agree that with your team. Make sure they know what and why. For everyone on a project team, whether you are the team leader or project manager, it's important to come to meetings prepared. There's nothing more frustrating than rocking up and having people just then start to read the papers for a meeting, or only just looking at the agenda and realizing they have a point on it to deal with. So think about what you want to share, but also what you want to know, what you want to ask, you know, the things you want to understand. And the final thing on this particular point is that notion of being present. And I don't necessarily just mean physically or just on the screen, but actually engaging, understanding, actively listening, asking those questions that will determine what's going on. And not just for your bit of the project. You might have a particular element and then want to tune out, but knowing where it fits and really engaging with the whole of the project is something to be really, really thoughtful about. So just some starting thoughts, and these very much are ideas to get you going. How are you going to communicate with who? So we're going back to that who group as well. In terms of your team, what kind of tools are you going to use? What's going to work for you? And particularly in team meetings, how are you going to make them as effective a use of time as you possibly can? Thinking about your stakeholders, internal stakeholders, you may well have formal reporting mechanisms. How are you going to implement those? What are those structures going to look like? Where there are external stakeholders, for example, there might be compliance mechanisms you need to think about. Again, what strategies do you have in place to do that? How are you going to do that? That's more likely to be a far more formal kind of communication. And thinking about your end users, and we haven't really focused on them very much in this process. It's so far been very much around the team and the stakeholders, but ultimately you're doing this for a purpose and there is an end user. So how are you going to attract them? If they're people you need to have consciously and deliberately engage with your project, how are you going to do that? How are you going to generate information publicity? How are you going to understand what it is they want? So it's really important to think about the ways in which you might reach out to them. So that's the sort of 4 big who, what, how, and when parameters. But before I wrap up, and Terry, please feel free to jump in with any comments or questions that might have come through. I just wanted to touch on something that I think is absolutely critical, and this is this notion of creating safety in your team. It's all very well to talk about communicating about your project, but effective communication is going to happen most readily where people feel safe to speak up. So creating that sense of psychological safety in your project team, particularly as a team leader, is critically important. Many of you would have heard of Project Aristotle, which was a project that Google undertook many years ago, where they were looking at what constituted an effective team or what made a high-performing team successful. And over a period of a year, they undertook a number of different studies looking at Was it the constitution of the team? Was it the way in which the team was established in terms of the organisation itself? Was it a particular type of personality in the team? And ultimately what they determined was that the most common driving feature of high performing teams was that the members of those teams felt psychologically safe. It meant that they felt safe to speak up and to have ideas that were different and to challenge concepts and to really feel like they were making a valuable, important contribution to the project as a whole. So if you think about the way in which your team works and the space in which it works, as a team leader, do you allow people to feel safe? Do you role model that for them? Are you open? Are you vulnerable? Do you talk about your concerns and the things that you might have decided were more challenging for you than might have been otherwise? So do you give them the sense that it's okay to share vulnerability? What happens if someone makes a mistake? Is this an environment where they feel absolutely free to say, I've made that mistake? Please, this is what I'm thinking. I'm openly sharing that with the team, and I want to discuss how we resolve that. So what are you doing to create that sense of psychological safety and to ensure that your project is evolving in an environment where people feel free to bring those suggestions or to challenge what's going on? So it may be that you've been moving down a particular path and there's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of money, for example, that's already been spent on it, but you have a team member who has some genuine concerns. Do they feel safe to speak up? Or does the momentum of the project or the politics of the project or the cost of the project mean they feel unsafe? So those are the things that are really important, I think, to think about, not just in terms of your broader project, but the way in which you create a mechanism for communication. Underpinning it all, do people feel safe? So Terry, over to you. Any questions, any discussion?
I've certainly got a couple of questions. Brilliant presentation. Thank you so much, first and foremost, for that, Jan. And just couldn't agree more with you in terms of particularly that last point, that particularly in innovation projects, just being able to feel that people can contribute and that those contributions might be really different from what other people are speaking about. Yeah. So, yeah, absolutely underscoring that. I wanted to just ask a couple of quick ones. Firstly, and I'm thinking back to the slide when you're particularly going through, I guess, the tools for communication that people are using now. How are you seeing that kind of play out in the real world, as it were, so that intermix of what effectively were old tools now being used for the first time, but new tools as well? Because, I mean, I guess as we move into a world likely to be increasingly one of hybrid work, within any one meeting, you're going to have some people maybe in the room together, but needing to use virtual tools for folks that might be online as well. So I just wanted to explore that a little bit more with you, if I could.
Yeah, so I think hybrid is going to be a really interesting challenge. But I also think it's going to be a short-term interesting challenge in that we will just have to get it right pretty damn fast, and then it will have to become business as usual. So I think we'll be talking about it extensively for a couple of months, and then it will just need to happen properly. And so I think I'm looking forward to the time when it's BAU rather than us still trying to work out how it works. But I think the really big challenge around that hybrid notion is, for a start, there's very different definitions of what hybrid is. And I think one of the things that I just wanted to emphasize for me, I'm sort of differentiating flexible working practices, which are incredibly important, with the mechanism of hybrid working. So as you say, some people in the office, some remote. And then the question becomes the most effective platform, but also the behaviors of the leaders of those interactions. So if somebody who's facilitating a meeting is physically in the room, how are they going to ensure the engagement of those who aren't? So it's all very well having, and we have some amazingly sophisticated platforms, some of which I wouldn't know how to turn on, that are making this easier and easier, and there's more coming out all the time. But I actually think at the end of the day, it comes down to the attitudes and behaviors and skills of the people who are part of those meetings or part of those interactions, ensuring that every single person is properly engaged. And that's where I do come back to things like, if you're remote, the video on where appropriate just makes such a difference, because you are, at least your head is in the room.
Yeah.
I think it's actually particularly challenging where you have almost everyone in one form and one or two in another. It's very easy for those people to get lost. The other thing I think that people don't really take into account as much is hybrid is harder to do. It takes longer to set up. There's more fiddly bits. You have to be far more conscious of your various forms of interaction. And everything takes a bit longer. Yeah. And I think people underestimate that.
And I guess the other point in all of this is that was coming through to me as you were speaking as well, is that communication doesn't just equal meetings.
No.
You know, people sometimes think, let's have a bunch of meetings and we're communicating, but it's almost in some respects what's happening in between the meetings that's critical, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's where it gets even more challenging with hybrid. You know, there is that fear of out of sight, out of mind. If they can't see me, they've forgotten about me. And that's where those additional check-ins, and then I'm not talking about formal meetings, I'm talking about the 5-minute check-in, how you're going, just making sure everything's okay, moving on. Those are critical to make people feel like they're still part of that unit. And that's something that we have to, I think at the moment, people have to do consciously, they have to do it deliberately. Hopefully over time it will evolve into something that again is part of that BAU, that's just the way we do things.
Yeah, an exciting time to be thinking about this really, because communication is just undergoing so much change. So, you know, thank you so much. As I said, again, a brilliant presentation. Sadly, we're at the end of our time, so I do need to wrap up, but just want to underscore again that, you know, we've taken the time to have this dedicated session with Jan because, as we said at the beginning, it is something that gets overlooked way too often, and there is real value in taking the time to think about this, because miscommunications, gosh, Jan, I know you know as well as I do, wow, they can just blow a project up or derail it really, really quickly. So if you've got more questions for Jan, I know that she is open, and thank you for this as well, Jan, to being contacted via LinkedIn. So just, or any other mechanism, but you'll find her definitely on LinkedIn to be able to drop her a note or to communicate with her there. Thank you everyone for attending. It's been lovely to have you here. Don't forget, if you want to stay up to date with the work of the Centre, do please follow us also on LinkedIn, Facebook or Twitter. So until next time, thank you very much again, Jan, and we'll see you all again soon. Bye.
Bye.